Dear Father in heaven, we just want to thank you that you've brought us all through to this point, and we just want to do your will, and we just ask that we can have your help and your strength, and that you'll hide me behind your cross. I pray for everyone here, and I ask your Holy Spirit for each one, and we pray that we could do as you wish. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. So I think that we needed to start with a quick review of this last one, just for the camera, the audio. So basically, what we have is a framework that is built on the progress of the Ottomans, starting with the start of the First Woe and the Battle of Nicomedia, and tracking how they capture each of their cities. There are 3 cities that they capture from the Byzantines and make into capitals. And then around this basic framework, there are other interrelated events, but the main thing is that you'll see a corresponding event to do with the progression of how the Byzantines and the Catholic Church is relating to each other. So, so we start with the Battle of Nicomedia, and 27 years later, I think 27 is a very significant number when we're talking about the woes and probably more broadly as well. You come to the 6th of April 1326, when they capture their first city from the Byzantines. It's Bursa, and it becomes their first capital. And then in the same year, you have the marriage of Anna of Savoy. She was an Italian or French Catholic princess, and she was married to Andronicus III. He was the emperor. So in the year 1326. I haven't gone into any of the detail here, but what you have is her family having interactions with the young John V, who was her son and the next emperor. And he received a lot of military aid from her family, and also a lot of pressure from them to actually convert to Catholicism and try to unite the Byzantine Church with the Catholic Church. So the next step you have is that John V actually does convert, so he goes through with that commitment, and in the same year you have the Ottomans capturing the city of Adrianople, which was a very significant strategic city for the Byzantines. So they captured that, and it became the second Ottoman capital. We move along, and I'm not quite sure of the full significance of this yet, but I know that it was one of the last efforts of the allies of the Byzantines to try to address the expansion of the Ottomans in their area, and they were destroyed in 1439. And I think this lines up with the official church union which took place. This is quite a long time after John V. This is a few emperors down the track. But there was an official church union which took place in Italy, and it was a decree, and so that the nation essentially converted to Catholicism at a high level, but all the population just rejected the union. The emperors were never brave enough to actually proclaim this union, which was something that the popes really wanted. When the emperors were requesting help, they would put forward this problem that you haven't proclaimed the union yet. So that was actually done in 1452, and the same year you have Mehmed II, who was the new sultan and the one who actually conquered Constantinople. He began his siege preparations. That's when they started building forts and building those enormous cannons and all that type of thing. It happened in 1452. Finally, in quite a remarkable transformation, you go from this absolute vehement dislike for each other between the Byzantines and the Latins, they just reject this union entirely and say that they won't even set foot in the cathedral until it's been cancelled and repudiated. But on the very last night before the end, when Constantinople was taken, they all went into the cathedral together and had mass without a quibble. So you can mark this end of descent, and for me, I look at that symbolically, and I think it points forward to a time when that union is affected in our time, and when dissent is not tolerated. I think it could indicate persecution as well. But this is in 1453, and then the very next day, Constantinople falls, and it becomes the third and final capital of the Ottoman Empire. So I think that's quite a clear relationship. I'm not saying that it's cause and effect, but I think that it's quite clear enough that you can notice that connection, year from year. Well, I suppose, until the end of their... I think it's the capital of Turkey now. She just asked if Constantinople was the capital until 1840. I think it still is the capital. Or is it Ankara now in Turkey? Ankara. Yeah. And it's still their city. It's still a major... it has such historical and cultural value. It's a big part of Turkish identity. So now what we're going to do is look at, we've kind of put the life of John V Palaeologus and this progression of his family essentially leading to the fall of Constantinople. We've sort of allowed those two to be the basis for what I'm going to do next, and that is look at all of the 7 thunders, the 7 emperors all the way through. So I hope I can do this fairly succinctly. And what we are ultimately going to be doing is lining these up with the 7 last kings of Judah. So first of all, I just need to explain how you actually determine the emperors, because over the course of the history of Byzantium, there were many, many emperors, and there were many, many co-emperors, and so we can't count them all as emperors, for a purpose like this. But what I've done is I have just gone with the way history determines it. And so history sorts the line of emperors by the emperors that achieved the status of sole emperor. So you had to be the sole emperor, you had to have full imperial command, you had to be in control of the empire to actually count in the line of emperors. There were lots of co-emperors with varying degrees of authority. Some were very, it's just a really symbolic thing, and others had more authority. But to track the actual 7 last emperors, what we're going to do is just allow ourselves to follow the same method that history uses, and it's just those that achieved sole emperor status. And there's really not that many individuals other than these 7 in that history anyway, so it's quite easy. The other thing I should mention is that having determined each of these individuals, that they qualify to be part of this 7 thunders for the fact that they were sole emperors, I found that once you'd established that and identified those individuals, you got more information from looking at their whole career as ruler even so. So these emperors did sometimes rule as co-emperors or as regents. That's in the place of the emperor who's gone on some sort of expedition or whatever. So ruling in the place with full imperial command. When you look at those aspects of their rule as well, it kind of fleshes out the picture. So that's my two little rules for how we're kind of navigating this. So we're going to start with John 5, Paleologus and Manasseh. You know, there's about 5 ways to spell it. I tend to go with the Greek way of spelling it. It's P-A-L-A-I-O-L-O-G-O-S. So you could probably pick up a bit earlier than this, but I've started with 2 Chronicles 33 verse 11. You're right. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 11. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them, this is the armies of Judah. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and bound him with fetters, and carried him to Babylon. So this is interesting. We know that there's a few really significant prophetic markers here. So we'll just first identify the date and the significance of Manasseh being carried away. I'm going to read from Memoirs of William Miller, generally known as A Lecture on the Prophecies, etc., page 76. From a further study of the scriptures, I concluded that the 7 times of Gentile supremacy must commence when the Jews ceased to be an independent nation, at the captivity of Manasseh, which the best chronologers assign to BC 677. And Ellen White says in Prophets and Kings 382.3, as an earnest of what would befall the people should they continue impenitent, the Lord permitted their king to be captured by a band of Assyrian soldiers, who bound him with fetters and carried him to Babylon, their temporary capital. This affliction brought the king to his senses. He besought the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, and prayed unto him. And he was entreated of him, and heard his supplication, and brought him again to Jerusalem, into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord, he was God. That's 2 Chronicles 33:11-13. But this repentance, remarkable though it was, came too late to save the kingdom from the corrupting influence of years of idolatrous practices. Many had stumbled and fallen, never again to rise. So you've got your beginning of the seven thunders here. And then we have John 5 Paleologus. So I hope this should be kind of familiar by now. I hope it's not just a bunch of new information. John sought a council to discuss church union, but Pope Urban V dismissed the idea, suggesting instead that the Byzantine emperor come to Rome. Perhaps moved by the loss of Adrianople, John V did make a journey to Italy, and in October of 1369 he made a personal profession of the Catholic faith and submitted himself publicly to the authority of the Pope. John remained for some time in Rome, and then in Venice, not returning to Constantinople until the autumn of 1371. Unfortunately, the abasement of the emperor did not result in any aid from the West. So we have, he's carried to Babylon and he submits to the king of the north. And John V goes to the Pope and submits to the king of the north. So we've read this quote already today. Remember when we spoke about how John V was compared to Constans II and also to Constantine the Great? The Pope himself made that comparison. And so he signed his confession of faith and sealed it with a golden seal, and it's still in the church archives to this day. So we've read the quote for that. And what he did was he publicly abjured the schism. So he publicly repudiated the fact that his own church was schismatic, had separated from the true church. So he's really selling out himself in a way in order to try to appease the king of the north. Next we have Ammon. And John 6. So if you remember, we were talking this morning about how John the 6th had been put in place as the legitimate leader of the regency for John V when he was a minor. And so when he was actually deposed from that position, he actually went and declared himself emperor. So you kind of had this funny scenario where they were both emperor for a while, and then they kind of settled down into one was sole emperor and the other was co-emperor, and that continued for a while. And so anyway, he actually became emperor, this John V. And what we're going to mark in this history is conspiracy. In their own administration. Conspiracy in own administration. So we look at Ammon. So we go to 2 Kings 21, verse 19. Ammon was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. And then we'll drop down to verse 23. And the servants of Ammon conspired against him and slew the king in his own house. And the people of the land all slew them that had conspired against King Ammon, and the people of the land made Josiah his son king in his stead. So we've already read this quote today as well. So this is when John the 6th, as the head of the regency, left to do some military duties. The storm broke in September 1341, when Cantacuzene left Constantinople to perform his military duties in Thrace. As soon as he was gone, his political opponents, led, bribed, or flattered by Alexius Apocaucus, whipped up support for the formation of a regency composed of the Patriarch, John Colicus, and the Empress Anna. The Patriarch needed no persuading that he was effectively its head. Anna was induced to sign an order for Cantacuzene to resign his command and disband his army. He remained convinced that the right was on his side. The issue was to be resolved by another round of civil war, more devastating in its consequences than any that the Byzantines had ever brought upon themselves. Apocaucus saw to it that Cantacuzene was denounced as a traitor, set upon seizing the throne for himself. His associates and the members of his own family were arrested and their property in Constantinople was seized. So Ammon was killed by his own servants. And John VI had the members of his own administration turn upon him and kick him out. We have to come back and look at John VI again, because he's very interesting and quite important as well. So we're going to move on next to Josiah and Andronicus IV. And these two probably couldn't be more different. They're very, very different individuals. So it's quite interesting when you look at their lives to find a circumstance where they parallel each other, which I think is accurate. You can do that. So these two are temple preservers. So we'll go to 2 Kings 22, verse 3. And it came to pass in the 18th year of King Josiah that the king sent Shaphan the son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam the scribe, to the house of the Lord, saying, Go up to Hilkiah the priest, that he may sum the silver which is brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the door had gathered of the people, and let them deliver it into the hands of the doers of the work, that have the oversight of the house of the Lord, and let them give it to the doers of the work which is in the house of the Lord, to repair the breaches of the house, unto carpenters and builders, masons, and to buy timber and hewn stone to repair the house. Howbeit there was no reckoning made with them of the money that was delivered into the hand, because they dealt faithfully. So, yep. It's 2 Kings 22, verse 3 through to 7. So we can see that Josiah, he repaired the temple. He built up the temple. So now we look at Andronicus IV. Who was ruling as regent for his father, while his father was actually going and doing all this in 1369. So he was ruling with full power as the emperor, in the emperor's place, when this took place. So I found that when you consider that, it fleshes out the parallels that you can make. So John was detained by the Venetian government until he could pay what he owed to his creditors. He sent off money to his son Andronicus, whom he had left as regent in Constantinople, directing him to collect and transmit the necessary funds to Venice by selling ecclesiastical and other available treasures, and not to let him waste a long time in virtual imprisonment. So his father has said, go to the temples and take all the treasures and relics and things and sell them so that you've got money to bail me out. Andronicus, however, who was enjoying the exercise of imperial power and had small love for his father, made no effort to do as he was bid, and sent back word that their compatriots would not permit him to use the treasures of the Byzantine Church in this way, and that he was unable to raise from other sources the sum he said he required. So that's from the Papacy and the Levant, page 316. So Andronicus would not allow the treasures to be taken from the temple. So he retained the treasures. Next up we have Jehoahaz and John the Seventh. So we'll go to 2 Kings 23 verses 31. Verse 31 through to 33. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and put the land to tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. So you can look at it in a simple way, a direct parallel. These two were both removed from the throne by another power. They were taken away from they had their authority taken away from them. So we can look at Jehoahaz, John the Seventh. When all the forces except the friars had left the Golden Gate fortress on foot, Emperor John fled out of the city, and Emperor Manuel took over the city again. In the year 6899, 1390, the 14th year of the induction, on Saturday the 17th of the month of September, Emperor Manuel Palaeologus, he was a co-emperor at this time, left the fortress of the Golden Gate with foot soldiers, and some mounted soldiers drove his nephew out of the city and took Constantinople. So that's from Russian travellers to Constantinople in the 14th and 15th centuries. I haven't got a page number for that reference. Russian travellers to Constantinople. So you can look at it in a simple way. There's a direct parallel there. But I also found that when you considered other aspects of the rule of John the Seventh, he also reigned as a regent at a later time in his life. And when you opened that period to this sort of inspection, you could see that there were other parallels. Although it's different, it's not a direct parallel, it's a contrast. So I'm not sure if you remember, but this was the young emperor who usurped John V. I've just laid this out in simple chronological fashion, but in fact, there was a lot of flipping around in here. So I've just laid it out simply, each new emperor as they came along, but there's a bit of overlap and it's a bit messy actually. But this young emperor is the one that usurped this emperor, John V, at a later time. And it was the Sultan who actually gave him the resources and the support to do that. So you could look at it this way. Jehoahaz was removed from the throne by the king of the south, and John VII was placed on the throne by, I'm not going to call the sultans the king of the south, but it's the other entity in that story. When you look at the kings of Judah, you've got the king of the north and the king of the south. So you would just look at it as the entity other than the king of the north. So he was actually placed on the throne. I've got a quote here. It's from Russian Travellers to Constantinople, page 409. Actually, we'll go. That's a separate reference. When Andronicus IV died in 1385, John V, with Murad's concurrence, appointed Andronicus's son John VII to rule in Salimbria. After a trip to Genoa, however, and with the aid of the new Sultan Bayezid and the Genoese, the young John laid siege to Constantinople and forced his grandfather to take refuge in the fortress at the Golden Gate. So you can see that the Sultan actually gave him the power to do that, to actually usurp in that way. And we can look at that as a contrast. Jehoahaz was put to tribute by the king of the south. That was 2 Kings 23, verse 33. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and moving on a little bit, and put the land to tribute of 100 talents of silver. Whereas John VII, ceases to pay tribute to that same, because the Byzantines were in vassalage paying tribute to the Ottomans. But there was a brief period there where the Ottomans were in trouble from other more powerful Islamic entities, and so it was a breather for the Byzantines, and they were actually able to negotiate that their tribute was removed. So John VII ceases paying tribute. Let's have a look. So the Anatolian possessions of the Turks were now under control of Tamerlane. This is this other Islamic power. Bayezid's eldest son met with John VII in August 1402. In February 1403, he concluded a peace treaty on the Gallipoli Peninsula in which he gave back Thessaloniki, etc., all these other territories. Byzantium no longer owed tribute to the Turks. And Suleiman swore to become a vassal of the emperor. That was only one of the sons of the Sultan. It wasn't the Sultan himself. But in any case, you can see that in a contrast, John VII throws off his tribute. So how to put this? So Jehoahaz was removed from the throne and had his tribute imposed. John VII was set on the throne and had his tribute removed. So now we have Jehoiakim and Manuel II. And these two both made a trip to Rome, so to speak. So we'll read 2 Chronicles 36, 4 through to verse 8. And the king of Egypt made Eliakim his brother king over Judah and Jerusalem, and turned his name to Jehoiakim. And Necho took Jehoahaz his brother and carried him to Egypt. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon, and bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar also carried the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon, and put them in his temple at Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim, and all his abominations which he did, and that were found in him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And Jehoiachin his son reigned in his stead. But we've got Jehoiakim also going to the king of the north. And Manuel, he also had interactions with the papacy asking for help. However, he was a little reluctant to unite the churches in the way that the papacy required. So what he did was he tried to go directly to the Catholic nations that otherwise he would be going to through the Pope. So rather than going to the Pope and asking him to stir up support, he actually took a trip directly to the Catholic nations, although he did have interactions with the papacy as well. But one of the places that he went to was Rome. So we've got, this is just Britannica.com. When the Turks overran Thessaly and the Peloponnese in 1396, Manuel made a journey to Western Europe to appeal for help against them. He was graciously received in Rome, Milan, London, and Paris. He stayed in the French city for 2 years. His visits did much to promote cultural ties between Byzantium and the West, i.e. the Catholic nations, but no military aid was forthcoming. So we can see symbolically that he made a trip to Rome. So Manuel II travels to Rome. And I think that parallels the King of the North. We've got Jehoiakim and John VIII next. So 2 Kings 24 verse 8. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. And his mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. And we'll go through to, we'll see where we'll go through to. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. And Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers. And the king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign. So we'll just leave it at that, through to verse 12. So you can see that Jehoiakim also went to the king of the north. John VIII. He's next. So John VIII Palaeologus unites East and West churches at Council of Florence in 1439. So we'll just read a little bit about this council because it is quite important. So the Council of Ferrara Florence was an ecumenical council of the Roman Catholic Church in which the Latin and Greek churches tried to reach an agreement on their doctrinal differences and end the schism between them. The council ended in an agreed decree of reunion, but the reunion was short-lived. And what they mean by that is that it was still an official document that was in place all the way through to the end of the empire, but it lost support. The Greek clergy were sort of, there's a quote there which says how they were made to accept the union. It's quite interesting, but their support for it vanished as soon as they got back to Constantinople. However, it was still an official document because it was proclaimed a few years later, and it was in place to the very end. So it was short-lived in terms of the support that there was for it. The Greek delegation, numbering about 700, included the Patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph II, 20 metropolitans, and the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaeologus. And then it goes on to talk about the types of discussions that they had. They had issues with purgatory, with the Holy Spirit, with what type of bread they used. But really the main issue that they had was just a deep-seated and very long-lasting distrust and just a love of their own national pride. And that was really the main reason that they wouldn't unite. On 10 January 1439, the council, we can skip that. The decree of union between the two groups was signed on July 6, 1439. After their return to Constantinople, many of the Greeks repudiated the union. Meanwhile, the Latins completed union agreements with certain other Eastern churches. I haven't looked into any of that. So we've got the Council of Florence. It's the union of the churches. I'm just going to abbreviate. And that would be John VIII going to the King of the North. So, it's interesting, I just sort of making some very basic parallels between this and what we expect to happen in our own time, because I really just don't know quite how at the moment. But, one obvious parallel that we make is the joining of church and state and America becoming a Catholic country. So what we see here in this history is that the Byzantines already had a union of church and state. However, it was different than what you might expect. It was not after the model of the papacy, which is a really hierarchical top-down structure where the Pope is the absolute head, it's difficult to go against the authority of that position. It was more flexible. They really, and I haven't got any quotes for this, sorry, they really based their idea for this union of church and state on the idea that the emperor represented Christ and that the church represented the bride. So that's the way they saw it. And so what you do see is that it's a marriage, but it's the correct marriage dynamic. It's the state in control of the church, and it's not quite, it's difficult to explain, and I don't fully understand it. It's not quite what you would expect when you're thinking of the papacy. So I need to do some more research into that. But what I do note is that you're seeing a union with Catholicism. It's a progressive union with Catholicism. So leave the church-state issue aside for a tick, and you can see that parallel very clearly with what we expect in our own time. But having said that, you do really see that the Pope asserted himself quite emphatically over the Emperor in his office both as head of the church and head of the state. So we'll just have a little look at it. The last obstacles to the union, or at least to the declaration of the union, were removed during the month of June 1439. The differences relating to the Eucharist, purgatory and papal supremacy were by the Greeks giving way to compromise, fatigue and ignorance. So they're saying that the compromise on the Greeks to accept the Catholic position was because of fatigue and compromise. And the Latins contenting themselves with some measure of ambiguity and by not making too rigid issues of them. So basically the Latins are saying, we're not going to make fully clear what we're asking you to submit to, and you're so tired that you're going to do it anyway. That's how it happened. On 5 July, the higher clergy of both churches signed the Greek and Latin texts and of the Decree of Union. The union of the churches was announced on the forenoon of July 6, 1439, in a long session which Eugenius, the Pope, himself presided in the Cathedral of St. Reparata. Both Eugenius and John VIII, with their respective clergies, made public acknowledgement of their assent. That's some of that formal process that I was describing before, which I don't quite understand. So the Byzantine emperor, he was part of a Caesar-Papist model. That's, head of church and state. But like I said, it's just a little bit different. However, he did really submit, and we'll see that now. That was Papacy and Levant, page 61. So here we have a little excerpt from the actual council. This is part of what the Greeks had to actually agree to. We also define that the Holy Apostolic See and the Roman Pontiff hold supremacy over the whole world, and the Roman Pontiff is the successor of the Blessed Peter, Prince of the Apostles, and that he is the true Vicar of Christ, the head of the whole church. It's interesting that he makes that distinction, head of the whole world and head of the whole church, because you could be generous and imagine that by saying head of the whole world, he's describing the church as it spreads over the world, But they've got that distinction, so that's interesting. The head of the whole church and the father and teacher of all Christians, and to him was committed in Blessed Peter the full power of tending, ruling and governing the whole church, as is contained also in the acts of the ecumenical councils in the sacred canons. Also, renewing the order of the other patriarchs which had been handed down in the canons, the Patriarch of Constantinople should be second after the most holy Roman Pontiff, etc. Goes through the rest of the ranks of the other churches. But you can see that they really had to accept the primacy of the papacy over their own church. So that was actually from the Council of Ferrara, Florence, 6 July 1439, and you can see that at papalencyclicals.net. With their surrender and Greek concessions on the most important questions at issue, preparations were begun to draw up the Decree of Union. But as was perhaps inevitable, a conflict arose over the signing. Oh, hang on, where are we? Sorry, one more part. We've got submission of Emperor and Patriarch to the papacy. So, as I said before, the Patriarch of the Church in Byzantine was equal to the status of a wife in a marriage. So, it's kind of like there's an equality there, but there's a symbolic headship. It actually, when you look at that, that's quite the way it works. However, in relation to the papacy, they just relegated the patriarch way down, and this was a real affront to the rest of the Greek clergy. But I find really interesting the argument that they have about the primacy of the emperor versus the pope. In his desire to assume the role of arbiter, Pope Eugenius insisted that his throne be placed in the centre of the church, with the Greek representatives at his left and the Latins on the right. The Emperor John Palaeologus, however, considered this an infringement of imperial rights, for in accordance with Byzantine practice, it was the prerogative of the emperor as the vicar of God to preside over ecumenical councils. After a prolonged argument, a solution was achieved whereby, as the Greeks insisted, the papal throne was placed on the side of the Latins, but it was at the same time elevated above all others, including that of the emperor. Moreover, we won't have to go into that. So the Pope is determined to have his primacy demonstrated in some way. So here's the emperor trying to assert his own authority and say that he has the right to the right of the full dignity of his position, and the Pope is finding ways to make sure that it's clear that his position is lower than that of the Pope. It was perhaps inevitable that a conflict arose over even the signing of the document itself, for both Pope and Emperor claimed the honour of having their name inscribed at the beginning of the text. In true Western theocratic fashion, Eugenius affirmed the superiority of his rank to that of the Emperor, while John Palaeologus, in a last assertion of authority, maintained that, as from the time of Constantine it had been the imperial right to convoke synods, his name should take precedence. Before the desperate need of his capital for aid, however, the emperor gave way and the signing of the Horos began. So you can see how the Pope is really rubbing the emperor's nose in the fact that this union requires the acceptance of the papal supremacy, and that his rank is going to really drop because of this connection. So last of all, we have Zedekiah and Constantine the 11th. So we'll go from 2 Kings 25 verse 1. And we'll go through to verse 6. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came, he and all his hosts, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and they built forts against it round about. And the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And on the 9th day of the 4th month the famine prevailed in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the land. And the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between two walls, which is the king's garden. And let's just drop down to verse 6. So they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon to Riblah, and they gave judgment to him. And so Zedekiah was also taken by the king of the north. So I think that we can draw some general parallels here. Constantine also had his city destroyed, so we can say city destroyed. However, there is a little quirk here at the end, and I'm not sure that I understand it. When you track the king of the north here, you start with Manasseh, and it goes, everyone's seen the studies on Leviticus 26, and you've got these 4 interactions with the king of the north, and it's the king of the north who takes the king and destroys the city. However, when we come to this line, you can see that it lines up here, king of the north, king of the north, king of the north, but here it is not the king of the north that destroys the city. So, we have a little quirk here, and I'm not sure why. However, based on the strength of the rest of the parallels, I'm not really worried about it, I just would like to understand it. But in this history, it's the other entity that actually destroys the city. So you know how we were looking at the fact that throughout this history you've got the King of the North and the King of the South. And throughout this history you've got the King of the North and the Ottomans. And in this history, at this point, it is the Ottomans who actually destroyed the city. So I've just got a few ideas about it. And one is that really what this whole history is symbolising up here is the spiritual conquest. You know, we don't actually expect the papacy to come and capture, you know, physically capture and destroy cities. It's a symbol of this spiritual conquest. Whereas with Islam, you know, we do expect actual physical violence, you know, and destruction. It's not an issue, it's not out of place, because you also have, it still marks the Sunday law, because you also have this other 7 thunders, which I haven't touched at all, which is the 7 Ottoman sultans from 1299. So we can put that, we'll put it here. So you still have, there's 7 Ottoman sultans up to this point, and they actually inflict this destruction upon this city. But I kind of wonder if perhaps, if we consider what this line is teaching us, that it is a symbol of spiritual conquest, and you see down here quite clearly that it's a literal spiritual conquest. I think that event that we looked at, you know, when the 2 sides came together in the church on the last day, and they actually, you know, they put aside their differences. For me, that is the Sunday law marker, so far as the King of the North is concerned in this line. But for some reason, the actual destruction of the city, you can attribute as a Sunday law marker for the 7 thunders of the Ottomans. And it just aligns at the same point, virtually the same point. So, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the 7 thunders studies, where you can line up the waymarks with the names of the 7 kings. So I think that you can pretty well, obviously we're not linking these with the names, we're linking them with parallels and events of their lives. But I think that you can still identify the same waymarks. If you remember, John V, he had a time of the end associated with him on 2 counts, which is quite interesting. From 1299 to the point where he began to reign, it was 42 years, which is a 1260, so that's the time of the end. And then from 1299 to the point where he actually converted in 1369, that was 70 years. So I think you can also mark another time of the end, which we can put on a line in a different way. But so here we've got time of the end here on 2 counts, so we can put time of the end. With Ammon, it's the increase of knowledge. I'm not really so sure about this one yet, but what I do know is that while we put these 2 separately chronologically, they virtually reigned simultaneously for a lot of their career, and John was a child, so you could kind of mark, you know, since this is kind of like a parallel reign, you can mark an increase in knowledge as a child grows in that history. But I'm not really sure about that yet. Josiah is the foundation. And when we're talking about repairing the temple and retaining temple treasures, it puts me in mind of William Miller's First Dream, where he's talking about the truths the treasures, you know, all the new understanding in the little box, which is the foundation of the year day principle. So I kind of see that as we can relate it to William Miller's dream in the year day principle. For Jehoahaz, this is also where it's a little bit different. I think that we generally mark Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim as 9/11. It's the removing and setting up of kings. So it's like leadership being bypassed at 9/11. So we can certainly see that in whichever way you want to look at it. You can see that in with a direct parallel, he was removed, but in a contrast, he was set up by the enemy. So we can put 9/11 there for, in the same sense, it's the setting up and removing of kings. For Jehoiakim, we're going to mark him as midnight because he actually died on the 21st of July, 1425. So I'm going to mark him as midnight. For Jehoiakim and John the 8th, I'm going to put this as midnight cry. Everyone knows that Jehoiakim marks the midnight cry. It's where you join with Jeroboam II. It's the midnight cry. And I also think that it lines up very nicely that you have the Council of Florence, which is the union of the churches, which is the conversion of the entire nation to Catholicism. So you expect to find that at the midnight cry. And obviously we're marking the destruction of Jerusalem for Zedekiah and symbolically the destruction of the city of the arms of the papacy, the Byzantine, the Eastern Romans, marking those two as the Sunday law. So I think it ties in quite nicely in a number of ways with what's already been established. I think it's also interesting, Parminder was saying a little while ago that when you look at Seven Thunders and you see a number 3, that's a restoration, and if you see a number 4, that's going to be a progressive destruction. So you can note 1, 2, 3, 4 Johns in this history. So I think that that is indicative of a progressive destruction. Also, you've got Constantine, he was the 11th, so you can see that 11th hour workers, that's an indication of the Sunday law, and he was also 49. So I'm going to see that as 490 and a close of probation. So that is that part finished. I'm going to rub it out now, and we're going to look at something a little different. If everyone's okay, so that's being rubbed out. You want to take photos? I forgot to mention earlier, I've just rubbed out that 49, and we were doing that little comparison of the life of John V and how it seems to mirror the whole of the events that happened to the empire. When he had to raise that structure, the Golden Horn Castle, that was in the 49th year of his reign, so you can tie that as well. with your 49 Sunday law marker at the end with Constantine. So that's another little parallel. So, we're going to look at this idea again that the seventh to last emperor, John V, had 2 times in the end, and it's interesting that that would be the case, and you can clearly see indicators really anchoring both of those points in time and anchoring them to those waymarks as well. So you've got his 42 here. And you've also got in 1369, you've got his 70. So a while ago, I found, quite by accident, that when you add up the reigns of the first 7 kings of Israel, you come to a total of 84 years and 7 days. And if you want the references, I've got them here. You've got Jeroboam, who reigned for 22 years. That's 1 Kings 14, verse 20. Nadab, 2 years, 1 Kings 15:25. Baasha, 24 years, 1 Kings 15:33. Elah, 2 years, 1 Kings 16, verse 8. Zimri, 7 days, 1 Kings 16, verse 15. Omri, 12 years, 1 Kings 16, verse 23. And Ahab, 22 years, 1 Kings 16:29. And there's one of those little parallels that I was mentioning. You've got the first of these 7 kings reigns for 22 years, and the last of these 7 kings reigns for 22 years. You remember that I was talking about the first Constantine, Manasseh, was compared to Constantine, 2 different Constantines, and then of course at the end we have a literal Constantine. So I've often wondered quite what to do with this total of 84 years and 7 days, wondering about inclusive reckoning and whether you can separate these 2 symbols or whether you have to regard them together, and I'm still not really sure what to do with it. However, when you look at 84 years and you look on the chart, you've got 84 in the way the 2520 is computed. So 84 times 30 is 2520 days. So you can see that it is connected to the 2520 and it's clearly connected with the 7 thunders. So I kind of wonder if perhaps we're being given parallel symbols. 84 is being shown to be an equivalent of 7, because you've got 7 days, goes to 7 years, 2520. So that's kind of what I am thinking that might be, although I'm really not sure. I'm quite open to being corrected. And there's also another instance of an 84 being joined with a 7. If you go to Luke chapter 2, verses 36 and 37. And there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher, and she was of a great age, and had lived with her husband 7 years from her virginity. So she was married for 7 years and then her husband died, is what I'm understanding that to mean. Verse 37. And she was a widow of about 84 years. That's 84 years. Which departed not from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. So I'm not really sure how that ties in. However, I do note that it is an 84 being connected with a 7. So I'm just wondering if that's the connection. Is it their 25-20 equivalents? So we've got our first 7 kings of Israel. And the total of their reigns comes to 84 years and 7 days. Then we go to the last 7 kings of Israel. And you've got Jeroboam II, he reigned for 41 years. And the reference is 2 Kings 14 verse 23. Zechariah 6 months, 2 Kings 15 verse 8. Shalom 1 full month, 2 Kings 15 verses 13 and 14. Menahem 10 years, 2 Kings 15 verses 17. Pekahiah 2 years, 2 Kings 15 verse 23. Pekah 20 years, 2 Kings 15:27. Hoshea 9 years, 2 Kings 17 verse 1. And when you add all of those up, you come to 82 years and 7 months. And I have no explanation of how to tie those two together or how they might be equivalents. But I think it's significant. I'm quite open to correction if anyone can think of why that wouldn't be the case, but yeah, I'm kind of waiting for something else to happen with that. So the last 7 kings of Israel, it's 82 years and 7 months. So I'm not going to read the quote. We know all about when John V converts to Catholicism in this year. This is when he comes to power. Interestingly, there is another aspect of this submission that he first makes. I really feel that he parallels Manasseh when he makes this, he initiates this, it's when he takes the first major step in this spiritual conquest. Byzantium is overtaken by the king of the north. However, there is another important aspect of this loss of independence, and we did touch on this earlier as well. It's 1371. And it was their Ottoman vassalage. So Byzantines go into vassalage to the Ottomans in that year. And we have a quote here that I will read. This is from A History of Byzantium, page 318. In the absence of the emperor, the situation in the Balkans deteriorated further. The successors of Stephen Uros Vukasin and his brother Jovan Uglesa attempted to organise opposition to Ottoman expansion, and the Byzantines were thinking that they wanted to get involved with that. So the Byzantines are not the only ones struggling with Ottoman expansion in this region. It's all the European nations round about. And so the Byzantines had high hopes for this attempt to actually expel the Ottomans. They weren't involved, but they were connected to it. And on 26 September 1371, about a month before John V's return, the Serbs confronted the Ottoman army at the Maritsa River near Chernomen. The Serbian forces were annihilated, and the whole of the southern Balkans lay open to the Ottomans. John V saw the lesson from this battle, and shortly after his arrival in Constantinople, he sought a treaty with Sultan Murad, hoping that in this manner the Ottomans could be persuaded to leave Byzantium of its few holdings of Thrace. As a condition of this treaty, however, John had to recognise the Sultan as his superior and to pay regular tribute and contribute troops to the Ottoman army when asked to do so. Thus, in a short period, John had submitted himself to two of Byzantium's enemies, first the Pope and then the Ottoman Sultan. So it was the point that the clear history that we have is the 26th of September. And this is important too, this comes up again, but not now. So now we have the 7 last kings of Judah, which we just looked at and we just compared with the 7 kings of Byzantium. And I might have got my pages a little bit out of order. This might have been better to put the last one. Anyway. Manasseh began to reign in BC 698. We're just going to do one further comparison. 698 BC. So we can just refer to Theodore for that. This is that document that he has called Bible Chronology. Usher places Manasseh's first year as 698. William Miller does, because you work back from 677, which is the 22nd year of Manasseh's reign. So you work back and you arrive at 698 BC. And they ended so Zedekiah was carried away in 586 BC, and this is a period of 112 years. Then you've got John V. He began his reign in 1341, and the empire went through and continued until 1453 with Constantine, and this is a period of 112 years. So that's another parallel that we have. And this is something that I've only managed to find since watching Theodore's presentations, because when you do the same as we have done with these ones and add up their reigns, you come to this amount. However, it's only symbolic, because in actuality, if you could find the first year that they reigned and the last year that they reigned, you probably find that it's a bit longer. If that makes sense, because there are probably little gaps between when kings actually came to power and that type of thing. When you do the same, when you do this with the kings of Judah, what you get is 110 years and 6 months. And I think that is symbolic also, because there are other 110s in the Bible, which I'm not going into. But it's interesting when you actually find the literal duration. So Manasseh came to power in 698 BC, and Zedekiah was carried away in 586 BC. It's 112 years. That fills you in for what you miss when you're only counting their literal reigns, and then you get the same period of time. I think that's amazing. So we have the second row in here. And we're just going to compress it a little bit. And we're going to look at what these 82s and 84s actually do. It's a little bit out of proportion. But you see what you have here is John the Fifth converting, so making that spiritual submission, and here he makes a political submission. He becomes the vassal of another empire. So you have a period of 84 years through to the final end, and you have a period of 82 years through to the final end. So it starts with spiritual, and then moves to political. Then when you come over here, this is the end of the second woe, and you come through to 1922, that's when the Ottoman Sultanate was actually terminated. So now you have a political termination. And in 1924, you have the Caliphate being terminated. Now the Caliphate, I'm sorry I haven't got any quotes at the moment, is the aspect of a sultan's role in which he is the spiritual head of the entirety of Islam. So he's the spiritual head. It's kind of like the Muslim Pope in a way. I mean, you could make that parallel. So, over this period of 84 years, you have a chiasm. You've got a spiritual submission, a political submission. When you flip it and reflect it the other way, obviously, if you start at the beginning of a process, chiastically, you're going to have to flip it to get to the end of a process. So what we see is, at the very end, reflected chiastically, a political termination and a spiritual termination. And so I like what this allows us to do, because people like to point at 1840 and say that Josiah Lich was wrong, the Ottoman Empire was not destroyed, it continued for 84 years, and for me, that's perfect because it's part of the prophecy anyway. What you have is, this is the beginning of the process. The first woe will chart the rise of the Ottomans. Sorry, this is a bit messy. The second woe charts the power of the Ottomans and the beginning of their decline. And this second part of the chiasm takes you through to the end, the absolute end of the Ottoman Empire. So, this structure actually encompasses every aspect of the Ottoman Empire. And so we're not really marking the end here. What we're marking is the beginning of the end. And then it continues and it goes all the way through. Interestingly, and I won't go into too much detail because I think we need to stop soon, but there are 7 Ottoman sultans that reign from this point to this point. Technically, the last is not a sultan, he's a caliph, but he's still the Lion of Ottoman, and he's still exercising an office that was the sultan's. So you've got a certain continuity from here through to here. You have 7 sultans. I'm just going to have to rub this out, sorry. And now I come to this funny little quirk where you've got 2 times at the end. You've got this one here, which starts the 112-year time period, which matches up with the kings of Judah and their 112-year time period. But then you've also got this time again, which points to 1369. So we went through the 7 emperors, from here through to the end, and there were 7. So do we have 7 emperors in this history? It's kind of impossible, really. However, I think it works, because what you have here is 6 emperors, but that very interesting individual that I was talking about, John VI, he was quite a remarkable person. He was an intellectual, he was a theologian, he was a very good statesman and politician. He was just a really remarkable person. And when he actually resigned in order that John V could assume his role as the sole emperor, because John VI had been such an interesting and exceptional person, he was actually ascribed an honorific title of emperor. So throughout the remainder of his life, and he became a monk, and he wrote books and histories, and he was an ambassador. He worked for the emperor. He was also what they call a grey eminence. That means the power behind the throne. So he was actually involved in the affairs, in the political and the ecclesiastical affairs, in a kind of a shadowy way, if you like, just a behind-the-scenes way. But interestingly, he was called the Emperor Monk, and this is not a historically imposed perspective. He was called this for the remainder of his life. And I'm just going to try and find a few quotes. On 10 December 1354, at a ceremony in the palace, John VI Cantacuzene divested himself of all his regalia and adopted the habit of a monk. And we'll skip along a little bit. Thereafter, for the remainder of his long life, Cantacuzene was to be known by his monastic name of Joseph, or, as a mark of deference, the Emperor and Monk Joseph Cantacuzene. So that is The Last Centuries of Byzantium, page 246. I'm just going to abbreviate. Joseph the monk returned to Constantinople in 1362. He was certainly there in April of the following year when the envoys from the Emperor of Trebizond were in the capital. The chronicler of Trebizond, so this is an international personage, mentions that they had an audience of John V Palaeologus and of the Emperor Joseph Cantacuzene the monk. So you've got reference, this is in contemporary international records of him having this honorific title, which is a symbolic thing, but I think that the symbology is quite clear. He was a type of emperor for the rest of his life, and he was involved in the affairs of the empire. So that's one instance that they have of him being referred to as the emperor. For the rest of his life, as a mark of deference, people continued to style him emperor. As late as 1375, Durithius, the bishop of Thessalonica, cited a document referred to him by our most pious emperor and lord, the monk Joseph Cantacuzene. So that's two instances of individuals abroad who were aware of his special status with this honorific title of emperor. So I'm going to put 7 because you've got one symbolic emperor. And what I think is that from 1341 through to the end, that is our primary 7 thunders. But symbolically, as a secondary aspect, you've got this 84 years with 7 emperors. It's a component of this, but this is the main event. And what you can do with this secondary aspect is use it to mirror and confirm this aspect on this side. So I think that is the purpose of it, but I'm sure there is more to it than that. I'm almost done. One more little thing that I think is really interesting. When you look at the first 7 sultans of the Ottoman Empire, you've got, I won't list all the references, I can get them for you if you like. You've got Osman I, Orhan I, Murad I, Bayezid I, and then you have a period of internum where they lost they were under subjection to that greater Islamic power. Then you have Mehmed I, Murad II, and Mehmed II. So that goes from 1281 through to 1481, minus a period of 11 years. So you've got 1481 minus 1281 equals 200 minus 11 equals 189, 89 divided by 7 equals 27. So that's another 27 that you have associated with the Ottoman Empire and the woes. So, why did you place this? This is when the first Ottoman Empire began to reign in the year 1481. Oh, sorry, no, the last one. That's when he finished. And the first Ottoman Sultan began to reign in 1281. So that's 200 years. Then you have an interim period where there was no Sultan, so you minus that. You get 189, you divide that by 7 and you have 27. So I think that that's no accident. Okay, so I'll just do a quick revision. I'll try. We looked at the 7 last kings of Judah, and we lined those up with the 7 last emperors of Byzantium. We found that you could parallel events in their lives and connect them that way, and you could also line them up with the waymarks in the conventional fashion that has been done before. They were both over a period of 112 years, so I think that's another pretty strong connection. Then we've looked at the fact that as a component of this 112, you've got this 84-year period, which is indicated with the 70, so it brings you to another time in the end, and that is where you can make a Manasseh out of John V. You go through to the end of that, you've got 7 emperors in a symbolic sense. So another 7 from this point, which mirrors again the 12 kings of Judah, sorry, the 7 kings of Judah. And what this allows you to do is when you mark the beginning of this process, there was this submission to the church, to the Pope, and this submission to the Ottomans. You flip that chiastically on the other side of the woe, and then look at the other side. You've got the end of the process, pardon me, you've got the final political termination of the empire, and you've got the final spiritual termination of the empire, both with these 82 and 84 intervals, and it lines up with the 7 last kings of, 7 first and 7 last kings of Israel, and we add up their reigns, you get 82 and 84. Not only that, it's more complicated, but I think that the connection is quite clear. And I think that we can leave it at that. Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you that you've brought us through to this point, and we thank you for your Sabbath, and we know that we get a double blessing on our Sabbath. And so we just want to claim that by faith. I pray that whatever is good and true and valued in this will stand, and I just offer the whole thing up to you. I give this whole situation over to you, and I just ask for your blessing and your guidance and your help for each person in this room. And I give thanks. In Jesus' name.